Hey everyone, Professor Lamar here, and welcome to the first video in our Chapter 9 video series. When we were learning about Chapter 8 last week, Chapter 8 tackled a variety of different experimental designs for basic experiments. And to give you a quick refresher, a basic experiment is an experiment that has one independent variable and one dependent variable. And we learned last week in Chapter 8, 6 different ways we can conduct basic experiments through things like a post-test only design, or a pre-test post-test, or a Solomon foregroup, or also things like an independent groups design, which is also called between groups, a within groups design, which is called repeated measures, and then also a matched pairs design. Those were the 6 different designs that we learned about in Chapter 8. And now that we're getting into Chapter 9, what we're going to learn about now involves different things that we should be mindful of when we design experiments. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And this is our Chapter 9 PowerPoint. So to give you kind of an overview of what to expect for the videos this week, we'll have 5 videos. Video 1 is going to be different things we should think about when we manipulate the independent variable. Video 2 is all about different things we should consider when we measure the dependent variable. Video 3 involves some other considerations like demand characteristics and placebo effects. Video 4 talks about expectancy effects. And then our last video here, video 5, is all about other considerations and how we can communicate research with various people like the public. So we have 5 videos here in this chapter, and this is our first one. So let's go ahead and get started. For Chapter 9, I've divided this chapter into 4 different components. And this first video here is going to tackle the first component, which is all about manipulating variables. When we think about manipulating variables, keep in mind again, we always manipulate what variable? The independent variable, which is why it's called an independent variable. And I also want you to think about something before we jump into this, which is what does it mean to manipulate something? When a researcher manipulates an independent variable, that means that the researcher controls how much of that variable participants receive. So there's different ways that we can manipulate the IV to control what participants receive and what they see in an experiment. But before we actually introduce the IV, we have to think about a few different things. The first thing that we should consider is that, we think that when we design a basic experiment, if we have an independent variable and a dependent variable, we expect that if we change the independent variable, this will then lead to changes in the dependent variable. Let's think for a second about a couple of variables and how if we change one, it could lead to another. For instance, an independent variable that we've frequently used for examples in this class is an independent variable of coffee consumption. So I'm actually going to switch things up a little bit and do a different independent variable. Let's talk about sleep instead. Maybe we think that if we manipulate sleep, like how much sleep participants receive, that will lead to changes in their happiness level. So in this design, if we think that sleep will lead to happiness, which of those variables is our independent variable? Sleep. And as researchers, we can manipulate sleep by controlling how much of it our participants receive. Maybe we have one condition where participants sleep for 4 hours a night, and then another condition where participants sleep for 8 hours a night. And then we think that when they wake up the next day and show up to class or campus or even just online now, if they take a survey online the next morning, we think that there will be differences in happiness between those who slept 4 hours and those who slept 8. Now, as researchers, we manipulate the IV and measure the DV. And so in this example, our dependent variable is happiness. And we think that if we change how much sleep people get, that will then affect their happiness. So when thinking about all of this, before we actually go out there and conduct the study, collect the data, and everything like that, it's important for us to construct operational definitions for both our independent and dependent variables. And why is this the case? Why do you think it's important to make sure that we have an operational definition for all of our variables? Well, you might be looking through your chapter concept worksheets now and being like, okay, what's an operational definition? How do I find this? And to give you a bit of a refresher, an operational definition is the way that we actually measure or manipulate a variable. Again, an operational definition is the way that researchers measure or manipulate a variable. And operational definitions are so important because they're required in order to study a concept empirically. In other words, operational definitions are needed if we actually collect data and do empirical research. So with that in mind, let's link back to our example with sleep and happiness. If we're looking at the relationship between sleep and happiness, and we decide to manipulate how much sleep participants get, half of our participants sleep for 4 hours and half sleep for 8. What would the operational definition be for sleep? The number of hours that people sleep. So we have a 4-hour condition and an 8-hour condition, and the operational definition is the thing that's changing between them. 4 and 8, the number of hours is the thing that changes. So the operational definition for sleep might be the number of hours, but what's the operational definition for happiness? Well, participants would wake up the next morning and take a happiness survey. And so that happiness survey is the way that we're measuring that dependent variable, happiness. Now, again, without these operational definitions, we actually can't run the study. So operational definitions are so important before we actually collect the data because they shape how we're collecting that data. Are we using a happiness survey or something else? Are we manipulating sleep by changing the number of hours participants sleep? Or maybe we could wake up participants every so often throughout the night and measure sleep by the quality of sleep instead of the quantity of sleep. Or I'm sorry, manipulate sleep by the quality of sleep instead of the quantity of sleep. Basically, there's different operational definitions for various constructs. And the way that we operationally define a variable will shape literally the entire study. Now, what I want you to do is think about your own research projects and the operational definitions that you started to kind of brainstorm with your team. You might not be doing an experiment. That's okay. You still need an operational definition for all of your variables if you're going to collect data for an experiment or a non-experimental design. So I want you to kind of think about what your operational definitions are and keep in mind the following things that we talk about in chapter 9 when you think about like refining those operational definitions and coming up with the measurement tools that you'll use to actually run your study. A lot of the things that we talk about in this chapter will be really useful for that and will help you kind of keep in mind certain things for your own data collection processes. Okay. So now that we've talked about operational definitions, we also need to just keep in mind a few ethical principles. Like for instance, before we even introduce the independent variable, the first thing we always have to do with participants is get their informed consent. All of our teams, when we collect research or when we collect data for our research projects, you will have an informed consent and all of your participants will complete that. Additionally, if you happen to use deception on your participants, what do you always have to have? A debriefing. So if you use deception in any way, it's always important to debrief your participants. And it's generally just best practice overall to have a debriefing form, whether you use deception or not. So in addition to a consent form, all of the research teams will also have a debriefing. We'll talk more about this in the next couple of weeks as you refine and really kind of figure out what materials you'll use to collect data. But I just want us to kind of keep these things in mind as we discuss chapter 9 and also as you continue to work on your research projects. All right, so let's talk about how we manipulate the independent variable. Well, as researchers, there are two ways that we can manipulate the independent variable. The first way that we can manipulate it is through what's called a straightforward manipulation. With a straightforward manipulation, this involves changes in how participants see information, like instructions or different like stimuli in an experiment, maybe like posters or videos or visuals of some sort. Straightforward manipulations are called straightforward manipulations because they just involve how information is presented to participants. They don't involve anything more complex than that. And so the classic example of a straightforward manipulation was actually one that was included in your book. It was something similar to what you see in this picture here. Now, if we were in class, I'd ask you to raise your hand if you've ever stayed in a hotel and seen a sign similar to what you see on this slide here. But since we're not in class, I just want you to think about this on your own. Have you ever stayed in or been to a hotel and in the rooms, in the bathroom for the hotel rooms, you see a sign similar to this? It says something like, "Dear guest, every day millions of gallons of water are used to wash towels that have only been used once. So you make the choice." A towel on the rack means "I will use again." A towel on the floor means "Please replace." Thank you for helping us conserve the Earth's vital resources. Now, these signs are very common in hotels, and they're designed to help hotel guests reuse their towels so that the hotel can save on water and laundry costs overall. And this is also a more environmentally friendly option if people tend to reuse their towels. Now, researchers wanted to see, though, if they could change a couple of things in this sign to make more hotel guests actually reuse their towels. And so they had a sign very similar to this, and half of the participants saw this sign. It said, you know, again, every day millions of gallons of water are used to wash towels that have only been used once. You make the choice. A towel on the rack means "I will use again." A towel on the floor means "Please replace." That's it. So in a hotel, half the participants saw that sign. In that same hotel, half of the participants saw a different sign. And that other sign had all of the same information. It looked almost identical. It just had one extra line. And that extra bit just said, help your fellow guests conserve water. And that's it. That's the only other thing that was included in the sign. So everything else was the same. The second sign said, "Dear guests, every day millions of gallons of water are used," and so on and so forth. But then after that, it said, "Help your fellow guests save water," right? Now, that's not a lot of additional words. That's not a big change from one sign to the next. They look almost identical. But I want you to think for a second. When people woke up the next morning and they were getting ready for the day and decided to take a shower, do you think that there was a difference between the people who saw the first sign and the people who saw the second sign in terms of how likely they were to reuse their towels? Yeah. The people in the second condition who on their sign, it also said, "Help your fellow guests conserve water." Those people were more likely to reuse their towels. And that's all it took. Just a sentence, "Help your fellow guests." That's it. And I want you to think about why just one sentence would lead to a meaningful difference between the groups. Well, it turns out that when people think that a lot of other people are doing something, they're also more likely to do that thing. Oops, going back there. Sorry, clicked on the mouse. And so, long story short, by just changing the way that information is presented, like here on a sign in this picture, we can create meaningful differences in our participants' behavior. And this is a straightforward manipulation because all it did is present information visually and change the way that information looked, even just subtly. Now, in a straightforward manipulation, sometimes you'll see that changes happen in the instructions. Maybe one group will get a different set of instructions than another. Or they'll change, instead of signs, maybe they'll have posters that show different things and stuff like that. So generally though, straightforward manipulations just involves like changing the way visual information appears from one group to the next in a study. But another type of manipulation that researchers can use is called a staged manipulation. And with a staged manipulation, researchers actually stage events in an experiment. And typically they do this when they are trying to create some sort of psychological state in participants, like anger or happiness or something like that. Or when the researchers are trying to kind of replicate something that would happen in the real world. And so the classic example of this is shown in this picture here. And this is designed to represent Ash's conformity experiments. And in Ash's conformity experiments, participants were brought into a room. They were sat down at a table with other participants, and then the researcher walked in. And when the researcher walked in, they said, "Okay, everyone, we're going to show you a picture, and that picture has a series of lines on it. And all I want you to do is look at the line in Exhibit 1 and the lines in Exhibit 2, and tell us the line in Exhibit 2, A, B, or C, that's the same length as the line in Exhibit 1. And so the participant was looking at this, all of the other participants were looking at this, and the researcher said, okay, so here are the pictures. Here's exhibit 1, exhibit 2. Which line in exhibit 2 is the same length as the line in exhibit 1? And I want you all to literally think about this for a second. Do you know the right answer? Okay, I think I do too. And so the researcher said to participant 1, all right, participant 1, which line in exhibit 2 matches the line in exhibit 1? And that participant said, line B. And the researcher said, okay, cool. Participant 2, which line matches the line in exhibit 1? And participant 2 said, yeah, it's B. Participant 3, B. Participant 4, B. Participant 5, B. Participant 6, B. And now we actually get to the real participant. The real participant, who's actually the only participant there, and I'll tell you why in a second, they're kind of wondering what's going on here. They didn't think the answer was B. They still don't really think the answer is B, but what do they say when 6 people before them said B? Yeah, they're more likely to say B. Even if they don't think it's the right answer, they're more likely to conform to what everyone else in the group is doing, even when they don't think that that's the correct choice. Now, in these conformity experiments, about 75% of participants conform to what the group said at least once. So I want you to think about that. That's 3 out of 4 people are kind of conforming to a group, even if they don't think the answer is the correct answer, which is really interesting. Now, we all know that the answer is actually A, that A is the same length as exhibit 1. But with our participants, or with ASH's participants in this study, again, 75% of them conformed to the wrong answer at least once in their trials, which is really fascinating. Now, this is a staged manipulation because the researcher Ash staged a study where it looked like a bunch of participants were sitting down at a table, but actually there was only 1 participant there. Everyone else was paid to play the part of a participant. They were what researchers call confederates, and what I like to call accomplices because the use of the term confederate can be somewhat problematic. So these people were paid accomplices who were working in cahoots with the researcher, and they were supposed to play the part of a participant who gives an incorrect response. Now, Ash, the researcher, was interested in seeing if when people give the wrong response, do participants conform to that? And it turns out, sometimes, yeah, participants conform. Now, this is designed to kind of see, this experiment is staged, so it's designed to replicate maybe something you would see in the real world and create a certain psychological state of inducing conformity in participants. So the next time you're out with some friends and you're deciding kind of maybe where to go to eat, or now that we're all kind of physically distancing, maybe the next time you're talking with your friends virtually and they're all like, oh, do you want to go hang out? And you know you shouldn't go meet up with them because you're supposed to stay physically distant. But let's say maybe friend 1 says, yeah, let's meet up. Friend 2 says, yeah, let's meet up. Friend 3 says, yeah, let's meet up. Friend 4, they're all in too. And then it gets to you and you're like, oh, I don't know about this. I know I should be physically distancing right now. Think about Ash, think about the conformity study, and keep in mind that a majority of people would conform at least once, but it doesn't mean that you should. Because again, physical distancing is important and we should all be practicing that regularly overall. One of the cool things about conformity, and then we'll start to wrap up with this video. One of the cool things about conformity is that it only takes 1 person deviating from the norm to break the pressure to conform for everyone. So when talking to your friends virtually, if 1 person wants to hang out and another one does and another one does and another one does, it only takes 1 person to stand up and say, no, I'd rather practice physical distancing and stay safe, for everyone else to also say that that's how they feel too. So it just takes 1 person to break the mold for everyone to then feel free to say, you know what, I'm not comfortable with that. Let's continue to talk virtually instead of being like, instead of breaking the physical distancing. Now, maybe this example is a bit too real, but either way, the point still stands. And again, as always, we should continue to practice physical distancing to help flatten the curve. Now, I want you to think for a second about the 2 types of manipulations we've talked about, straightforward and staged. Which one do you think costs more money? Staged, absolutely. When you're working with paid accomplices, you have to pay them. And so it takes a lot of money to pay people to pretend to be participants or stage something else overall. It also tends to take a lot more time to conduct a staged experiment. Imagine Ash's conformity studies. They only had a participant, like one participant in there, and they were doing different trials with different lines and stuff like that. And so to collect data with one person, it takes a lot longer than if you have 500 people staying at a hotel overnight and then they wake up the next morning and you can see who used a towel or not, right? So the cost of the manipulation tends to be higher in stage manipulations, but also think about the strength of the manipulation. A manipulation is considered strong when there's a big difference between one level of the IV and another level of the IV. And so your book, the authors of your book, Cosby and Bates, recommend that the manipulation of the independent variable should be as strong as possible while still appearing realistic. And this is important. Your manipulation of the IV should be as strong as possible while still appearing realistic. So if we think about, for instance, manipulating the variable of sleep, a weak manipulation would not have a big difference between one group and another. It would be like group A sleeps for 7 hours a night and group B sleeps for 8. Do you think we'll see differences in happiness between people sleeping 7 or 8 hours? No. The difference between 7 hours of sleep and 8 hours of sleep is not a lot, and that's a very weak manipulation because there's not a lot of difference between the conditions. A stronger manipulation would have a bigger difference between the hours of sleep. So what would that look like? We have a group of people maybe sleeping 4 hours and a group of people sleeping 8. Now that's a bigger difference there, and that's a stronger manipulation. You want your manipulation to be as strong as possible while still appearing realistic, which means that someone sleeping 4 hours technically is plausible. Sometimes that's all the sleep that we get for the night. But it would be a little unrealistic to have someone not sleep at all and then someone else sleep for 12 hours a night, because sleeping not at all or 12 hours tends to be some people's experience, but not the experience of the average sleeper overall. So basically, you want your manipulation to still be plausible and realistic while still being as strong as possible. Now, on your own, I'd like you to do an example. If you have the independent variable of social pressure and the dependent variable trying to get people to watch Tiger King, which if you haven't seen it, it's a documentary on Netflix. It's a wild ride, and also kind of glosses over a lot of important issues, which I'm happy to talk about with people if you like. But basically, if you have an independent variable of social pressure and a dependent variable of watching Tiger King, I'd like you to, on your own, design your own study with those variables that involves either a straightforward manipulation of social pressure or staged manipulation of social pressure. Take a few minutes, do that on your own, and this will bring us to the end of our first video. So when we start video 2, we'll talk about ways that we can measure the DV. But until then, I'll see you all then. Bye.